Have you ever wondered what happens when an institution built on empirical certainty encounters something that fundamentally shatters its understanding of the natural world? It does not investigate. Investigation requires a pre-existing framework, a shared language of scientific inquiry, a baseline of accepted reality. When faced with the truly incomprehensible, the institutional response is almost always categorization, filing, and profound orchestrated silence. I want to tell you about a maritime voyage that took place in the Antarctic summer of 1849. You will not find the complete, unredacted records of this expedition in the archives of the Royal Geographical Society. Not because they were lost to the damp of naval storehouses or the ashes of a fire, but because the meticulously documented observations of 42 men were systematically and purposefully removed from the historical record. The ship was the HMS Challenger. The navigator and commanding officer was Captain Henry Robertson. The destination was the uncharted Victoria Land region, pushing deeply beyond 76 degrees south into waters that, according to every known meteorological and oceanographic model of the 19th century, should have been locked in impenetrable pack ice. What the crew documented in that impossibly isolated frozen expanse, and the precise bureaucratic machinery that descended upon them when they returned to port, tells us everything we need to know about how the architecture of official history is constructed. It is not built purely on the bedrock of what actually happened. It is constructed entirely on the foundation of what powerful institutions can afford to acknowledge without destabilizing their own authority. To understand the magnitude of the suppressed documentation, we must first establish the unimpeachable credibility of the man at the center of the institutional erasure. Captain Henry Robertson was 42 years old when he navigated the HMS Challenger south from Hobart, Tasmania, in December 1849. He was not a man prone to poetic flights of fancy, nor was he a novice to the brutal realities of the Southern Ocean. Naval records detail 18 years of exemplary, unblemished service to the Crown. He was a hardened veteran of a grueling 1843 sealing voyage that had left the knuckles of his hands permanently scarred and disfigured from severe frostbite. Yet his professional reputation remained pristine. Within the insular, highly critical halls of the Admiralty and the Royal Society, Robertson was known as a master of ice navigation. His surviving pre-1849 logbooks are celebrated even today for their rigid, almost obsessive adherence to empirical data. His astronomical observations were accurate to the minute. His coastal measurements formed the undisputed basis for subsequent Admiralty navigational charts, and his psychological temperament was uniformly described by his superiors as one of cold, rational skepticism. The Royal Navy entrusted him with the Challenger because the geopolitical stakes in 1849 were exceptionally high. This was an era of intense, unforgiving international polar competition. British territorial claims, the prestige of the Empire's scientific apparatus, and the assertion of global maritime dominance depended entirely on the precise, credible mapping of the Antarctic coastline before the Americans or the French could claim the ice. The official expedition report, finally published by the Admiralty Printing Office in late 1850, is a testament to mundane institutional procedure. It is a masterclass in the bureaucratic sanitization of reality. The published volume runs to precisely 212 pages. It documents the departure dates, the standard barometric weather patterns encountered during the southern transit, the precise tonnage of coal and salted supplies consumed, and the unfortunate loss of 3 crew members to what the official record neatly categorizes as a combination of extreme exposure and advanced scurvy. It is dry, it is authoritative, and it is completely, aggressively unremarkable. But the institutional gaps surrounding this physical document are profound, and they are verifiable. Robertson's original handwritten expedition log, submitted directly to the Royal Navy Review Board in February 1850 upon their immediate return to port, was formally recorded in the Admiralty Intake Ledger. That ledger, which still exists in the archives at Kew, explicitly notes the submission of a manuscript containing over 500 pages of highly detailed observational data, along with a heavy portfolio containing 67 fragile glass plate photographs taken by the ship's officially appointed expeditionary photographer. When you compare the mathematical reality of the intake ledger to the published Admiralty report, the sheer scale of the institutional redaction becomes undeniable. Over 60% of Robertson's original, meticulously recorded manuscript was excised before the ink ever met the printing press. In the surviving, unedited draft table of contents, preserved only through a clerical oversight in the Naval Archives, there are 2 massive sections that have been entirely purged from every surviving official copy. Section 4, titled Observations Beyond 76 degrees South, and Section 7, titled Phenomena of Unexplained Origin. Furthermore, of the 67 photographic plates submitted and logged by the intake clerks, only 12 benign, unremarkable images of standard coastal ice shelves reside in the official archives of the Royal Geographical Society. The remaining 55 plates, representing the bulk of the visual evidence of the expedition, have simply vanished from the institutional record. These absences are not matters of imaginative speculation. They are documented bureaucratic facts etched into the ledger books of the Royal Navy. Just as factual is the highly unusual coordinated response of the Admiralty upon the ship's arrival in port. The men of the Challenger were not given standard shore leave to reunite with their families. Admiralty Board minutes from March 1850 show that the crew was immediately sequestered in secure naval facilities and questioned separately by senior intelligence officers. Transcripts of these interviews were never released to the public or the scientific community. Within weeks, the crew was systematically dispersed, quietly reassigned to distant, low-level stations in the Caribbean, or immediately discharged from service with a fraction of their promised pensions. As for Captain Robertson, the master ice navigator, whose empirical precision had served the Empire for nearly 2 decades, the institutional response was remarkably swift and utterly devastating. By April 1850, under a direct classified Admiralty order, his formal request for an independent psychiatric evaluation, in which he explicitly cited experiences in the southern ice requiring objective medical assessment, was co-opted. The evaluation records were permanently sealed under the Official Secrets Act. His personal journals and navigational charts were physically seized from his family's residence by naval officers, and he was quietly committed to the secure wing of Bethlehem Royal Hospital. The official institutional diagnosis was recorded as Antarctic dementia. The historical narrative was thus cleanly secured. In the eyes of the institution, Robertson was mad. The expedition suffered tragic but mathematically normal polar casualties, and the missing hundreds of pages of records were simply the ravings of a broken mind, best forgotten by an empire that preferred its maps drawn in straight, rational lines. The official, sanitized version of the HMS Challenger's voyage remains intact only if you deliberately ignore the private correspondence, the hidden diaries, and the deathbed testimonies that managed to survive the Admiralty's sweeping informational purge. The reality of what actually occurred beyond 76 degrees south did not begin to emerge until 1923, when Robertson's sister's estate was finally settled, revealing a hidden brass-bound box containing a collection of smuggled manuscript fragments and decades of heartbreaking, highly lucid asylum correspondence. This fragmented record was profoundly corroborated decades later in 1967, when the ship's surgeon's private leather-bound diary was discovered entirely by accident in a dusty estate sale in suburban London. When we take these independent, geographically separated accounts and cross-reference them against the known movements of the ship, a chillingly consistent narrative emerges, not a narrative of collective madness, but of highly trained men rationally documenting the scientifically inexplicable. According to the surgeon's private diary, the anomalies began in late January 1850, as the Challenger penetrated a dense region of pack ice that, according to all known nautical science and thermodynamics, should have crushed the ship's reinforced oaken hull to splinters. Robertson's surviving manuscript fragments, penned in his distinct, rigid handwriting, note that the ice formations they encountered completely lacked the chaotic, jagged, random physical structure of natural pressure ridges. Multiple crew members, whose panicked letters home were later meticulously tracked down by independent researchers, described the ice as possessing a massive geometric precision. They wrote of towering formations suggesting artificial symmetrical construction, structures that appeared to rise and fall, appearing and disappearing in an impossible silent rhythm aligned with the ocean's tides. The ship was only able to advance deeper into this impossible geography because they encountered massive, localized temperature inversions. The ship's surgeon, a man trained in the strict biological sciences of his day, documented regions of inexplicable stagnant warmth in the dead center of the freezing pack ice. They found vast expanses of open, dark, unfreezing water where the ocean should have been solid white. The men were sailing into an environment that fundamentally defied the basic thermal laws of the natural world, and their instruments proved it. Then, the physiological and psychological phenomena began to manifest across the crew. We must be clear, this was not the standard isolation fatigue or cabin fever common to long-haul polar voyages. The surgeon's diary is meticulous, devoid of emotion, and grounded in clinical observation. He recorded that separated men, sleeping in entirely different quarters of the ship, separated by thick wooden bulkheads, began experiencing perfectly synchronized night terrors. They reported identical, recurring nightmares of a massive, cold intelligence watching them from far beneath the freezing water. Their emotional states shifted in absolute unison, transitioning instantly from extreme lethargy to sudden, inexplicable, collective panic without any external stimulus. Physical symptoms manifested with the same impossible synchronization. Nosebleeds occurred simultaneously among men working the rigging on the freezing deck and men resting deep in the darkened hold. Geometric marks, resembling mild frostburn but forming specific repeating patterns, appeared on their skin overnight. The surgeon, desperate to find a rational medical taxonomy for what he was witnessing, wrote in his private journal that he was observing a biological impossibility, a contagion of the mind and body that moved through the crew not via pathogens, but like an unseen electromagnetic current. The environment itself seemed to react, to respond to their continued presence in the water. Robertson's fragments describe atmospheric phenomena that absolutely could not be categorized as the standard aurora australis. He wrote with the precision of a naval navigator of massive shifting lights moving deep beneath the ice with apparent calculated intentionality. These were patterns of luminescence that defied all known natural meteorological processes, seeming to deliberately track and mirror the sluggish movement of the Challenger. The ship's naturalist, whose official biological reports were entirely purged from the Admiralty archives, is quoted verbatim in the surgeon's diary. The naturalist observed and cataloged marine life at depths and freezing temperatures completely inconsistent with known species survival parameters, organisms that seemed to observe the ship with an intelligence that disturbed the scientific crew to their core. And then there were the acoustic anomalies. As the ship sat becalmed in the unnatural warmth of the open water, the crew did not hear the standard chaotic cracking and groaning of shifting polar ice. Multiple independent accounts from the surviving family letters describe terrifying rhythmic acoustic patterns echoing from the deep abyssal trenches. It was a low, resonant, bone-rattling acoustic vibration that the men, despite their different backgrounds and ranks, uniformly described in their private writings as the unmistakable sound of massive, slow, deliberate breathing. The timeline of the expedition itself began to physically shatter. Multiple witnesses, including the notoriously precise Captain Robertson, reported severe, localized time distortions. Whole hours of the watch were completely unaccounted for by the men on duty. The ship's chronometers meticulously maintained instruments that were the pride of British naval precision, began to disagree wildly with one another, spinning out of alignment with the sun. Robertson noted in a smuggled letter that the ship's physical position readings, calculated mathematically by the stars, completely contradicted their physical, visible location in the water. They were mathematically adrift in a geography that simply refused to obey the established rules of space and time. The climax of the voyage, the catastrophic event that precipitated the immediate frantic retreat and Robertson's eventual institutional silencing, occurred in the third week of February 1850. This is the period Robertson referred to in his asylum correspondence simply as the encounter. The exact physical nature of what they saw during those missing hours is deliberately obscured by the Admiralty's destruction of the 55 photographic plates and the surgical removal of Section 7 from the manuscript. But the brutal aftermath is vividly, horrifically documented in the surgeon's diary. Over the course of a single, endlessly long polar night, during a period of intense atmospheric electromagnetic disturbance and complete chronological dislocation, 3 men died. The official, published Admiralty report would later claim, to the satisfaction of the public, that these 3 sailors succumbed to a combination of exposure and advanced scurvy over a period of several weeks. The surgeon's private contemporaneous account vehemently, furiously contradicts this sanitized timeline. He recorded that the three men were found together on the pristine ice the following morning, frozen, completely solid. But they had not huddled together for warmth, as freezing men instinctively do, nor did their bodies show the gradual telltale physical degradation, the loosening teeth and internal hemorrhaging of scurvy. They were found frozen in upright, striding positions, suggesting they had walked off the edge of the ship and out into the desolate ice deliberately of their own volition. The surgeon noted his clinical detachment finally cracking to reveal profound horror that the facial expressions of all three frozen men were locked in identical states of absolute, paralyzing terror. Robertson's final, hastily scribbled note before turning the ship violently north simply read, "There is something ancient beneath the ice. It is entirely aware of our presence. It is observing us." And it took them. The return journey to civilization was a silent, frantic retreat, driven by a crew pushed to the absolute limits of human psychological endurance. Upon reaching the port in Hobart, Robertson attempted to submit his full, unvarnished 500-page report, naively believing that the Admiralty's stated commitment to scientific truth would mandate a massive, immediate investigation. He fundamentally underestimated the institutional instinct for self-preservation. The confiscation of the logs, the seizure of the heavy boxes of photographic plates, and the armed sequestration of the crew happened within 48 hours of dropping anchor. The institution moved with a terrifying coordinated efficiency. The ship's surgeon, realizing the Admiralty intended to bury the truth, attempted to bypass the naval authorities entirely and publish his biological and medical findings independently through a small scientific press in London. He died in 1852 from a sudden, completely undiagnosed illness just 3 weeks before the manuscript was scheduled to be typeset, his papers vanishing from his study the night of his death. The rest of the crew, scattered across the globe by immediate reassignment orders, learned the bitter, lifelong lesson of survival through absolute silence. Captain Henry Robertson, the veteran navigator who had simply done his duty and reported exactly what his instruments and his eyes had recorded, was locked inside the stone walls of Bethlehem Royal Hospital, diagnosed with a convenient madness that the British Empire found infinitely more palatable than the terrifying truth of the ice. When we rigorously examine the HMS Challenger expedition of 1849, we must draw a strict, uncompromising line between what is documented historical fact, what is consistent, cross-verified witness testimony, and what remains an impenetrable institutional secret. Here is what we can definitively verify through surviving physical archives. Captain Henry Robertson submitted a massive, comprehensive observational report that was subsequently gutted by Admiralty clerks. Crucial, irreplaceable photographic evidence was logged into the Naval Archives and then permanently suppressed. Crew members were subjected to separated, highly unusual military interrogations and immediately dispersed to disparate, isolated global postings to prevent communication. The ship's surgeon died under highly unusual documented circumstances while actively attempting to publish independent scientific observations. And a highly decorated, empirically minded naval officer with an unblemished record was indefinitely committed to an asylum under direct, classified Admiralty orders, his medical record sealed from public scrutiny for over a century. These are not speculative theories. These are documented, verifiable actions taken by one of the most powerful, resource-rich institutions on the planet. Here is what we have from consistent, geographically separated, cross-verified witness testimony gathered from diaries and family archives. Explicit descriptions of impossible geometric ice anomalies, severe and highly localized temperature inversions, synchronized physiological and psychological disturbances across a physically separated crew, complete chronometer failures, intelligent atmospheric lights, massive acoustic anomalies universally described as respiration, and the sudden simultaneous deaths of 3 healthy crew members whose frozen, terrified postures suggested deliberate hypnotic egress from the safety of the ship. Why did the Admiralty, an institution ostensibly dedicated to the expansion of human knowledge, respond with such overwhelming, absolute suppression? It is tempting to imagine a grand malicious conspiracy, a shadow cabal of men in smoky rooms. But institutional behavior is rarely driven by theatrical evil. It is driven by cold, calculating incentive structures, the Royal Navy's prestige, and Britain's absolute leadership in global polar exploration relied entirely on projecting an image of absolute mastery over the natural world. To officially acknowledge phenomena that suggested a complete, terrifying loss of navigational, chronological, and environmental control would have been strategically disastrous. Furthermore, the Admiralty's delicate partnership with the Royal Society required maintaining a strict, rigid, rationalist framework, admitting that an entire crew of hardened sailors experienced synchronized, unexplained phenomena threatened the foundational credibility of their entire scientific authority. There were also profound, immediate practical incentives for silence. If Robertson's true terrifying account became public knowledge, recruitment for future, essential polar expeditions would become virtually impossible. What sailor would volunteer to map the ice knowing what waited beneath it? The maritime insurance implications alone would have completely spiraled out of control. If Antarctic hazards officially included genuinely unknown, perhaps sentient dangers capable of bending time and driving men to walk into the freezing dark, expedition costs and financial liability would crush the global exploration industry overnight. It was structurally necessary, economically rational, and politically expedient to attribute the bizarre observations to the tragic, isolated psychological breakdown of a single captain rather than fund an investigation into a genuinely unexplainable, paradigm-shattering reality. Because the institution chose absolute suppression over scientific investigation, we are left with competing frameworks for interpreting what actually happened out there in the dark. One framework, the psychological one, suggests the extreme isolation, the relentless environmental stress, and the anomalous electromagnetic environment of the Antarctic pole caused a collective, cascading psychological breakdown, artificially amplifying natural phenomena like shifting ice acoustics and standard atmospheric auroras into a shared, contagious delusion. Another framework suggests the expedition encountered highly localized, still undiscovered natural anomalies, perhaps unique, massive geothermal venting mixed with extreme magnetic pole distortions that severely affected human neurology and instrument calibration. But there is a third framework, one that must be considered because it is supported by the sheer scale of the institutional panic and the absolute ruthless eradication of the photographic evidence. This framework suggests that Captain Robertson and his crew witnessed something intensely real, physically present, and entirely outside the accepted, comforting boundaries of 19th century natural science. Something that the 55 missing glass plates clearly, undeniably documented. We cannot know if the anomaly was biological, geological, or something else entirely, because the scientific consensus hasn't been allowed to examine it. The phenomena were not studied. They were institutionally marginalized, buried under a mountain of classified stamps. And what remains unknowable remains so precisely because the mechanisms of institutional power ensured that the scientific method was never, ever allowed to be applied. Captain Henry Robertson spent the final 6 years of his life locked within the cold stone walls of Bethlehem Royal Hospital. The letters preserved by his devoted sister document a man whose mind was not broken by his experiences in the Antarctic, but by the crushing, suffocating weight of absolute institutional betrayal. He remained perfectly lucid until his final days, his handwriting retaining the meticulous, rigid precision of a master naval navigator. His asylum medical records, which researchers eventually managed to access long after the official classification protocols expired in the late 20th century, describe a patient who never once wavered in his account, who refused to accept the comfortable lie of his own madness. He continually insisted to the hospital psychiatrists that the ice possessed an intentional architecture, that the freezing environment was acutely aware of them, and that the 3 dead men were not killed by the elements, but were deliberately taken by something that lived in the dark water. He died in the winter of 1856. The attending physician at Bethlehem recorded his final words, spoken with the calm, terrifying resignation of a man who knows he is leaving a world that entirely refused to listen to him. It is still waiting beneath the ice. The tragedy of the 1849 Challenger expedition is not just the destruction of one brilliant man's life and professional reputation. It is the deliberate, ongoing shaping of our historical narrative. What students of polar history learn in universities today is a heavily sanitized timeline of heroic human endurance, mapped coastlines, and the eventual triumph of science over the elements. What actually happened is buried in mislabeled archive boxes, forgotten estate sales, and the fading ink of smuggled letters passed down through generations. The lifetime consequences for those witnesses who dared to speak were absolute and devastating. But the fundamental human need to testify to the truth, to leave a record of what was seen, often outlasts the bureaucratic institutions that try so desperately to suppress it. In 1889, nearly 40 years after the voyage, an elderly, impoverished former sailor from the Challenger, living in a coastal village in Australia, gave a deathbed confession to his local vicar. The transcript, found tucked away in dusty parish records, contains a devastating final assessment of the Admiralty's narrative. Captain Robertson wasn't mad. We all experienced it. We all felt it breathing. They locked him away because they had to lock away the truth. This case does not exist in a historical vacuum. When we look closely at modern declassifications, a disturbing pattern emerges. In the late 1950s, a cache of naval documents regarding nuclear submarine operations in the Pacific Victoria Land region briefly became public through a Freedom of Information oversight before being rapidly reclassified by intelligence agencies. Those documents contained specific, highly redacted references to historical Antarctic incidents of a psychological nature requiring ongoing classification, and established strict mandatory avoidance protocols for navigating the exact coordinates Captain Robertson mapped in 1850. Even today, indigenous Antarctic expedition folklore, passed down quietly by the veteran guides, technicians, and support crews who spend their entire lives working on the ice shelves, speaks in hushed tones of waters that watch you, warning new arrivals to ignore the lights beneath the pack ice. When subsequent scientific expeditions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries reported similar electromagnetic anomalies, time distortions, and psychological pressures in the exact same region, their findings were met with the exact same institutional friction. Research proposals that exist outside established, comforting categories simply do not get funded. Their data is politely dismissed as instrument error, their careers quietly marginalized. What does it fundamentally mean when the established guardians of human knowledge choose institutional silence over rigorous scientific inquiry? When highly credible, extensively trained observers are systematically discredited, ruined, and locked away, simply because what they objectively saw destabilized the existing frameworks of reality. The suppression of the 1849 Challenger expedition reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. The historical record is not a clear, objective mirror reflecting reality. It is a meticulously curated portrait designed to protect institutional power. The gatekeeping is entirely structural. It operates not through dramatic assassinations, but through the mundane control of archival access, the quiet sealing of medical records, the denial of research grants, and the slow, quiet destruction of professional credibility. I cannot tell you definitively what Captain Robertson and his terrified crew encountered beyond 76 degrees south. The physical evidence that would allow us to analyze and understand it was either deliberately destroyed in the furnaces of the Admiralty or remains hidden in secure archival vaults that you and I will never be permitted to access. But the pattern of the cover-up itself, the sheer panicked weight of the coordinated institutional response against 42 men, is profound evidence in its own right. It is evidence that our collective understanding of the natural world is bounded not by what is actually true, but strictly by what is permitted to be known. Before you go, I want to hear your perspective on this. What do you do with a historical narrative where the echoing silence of the archives speaks far louder than the neatly published volumes of official history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you value deep investigations that respect your intelligence, that acknowledge the unknowable, and that dare to question the consensus, join us. We will continue to meticulously examine the shadowed spaces where official histories fracture and break apart. Stay curious. Look closely at the gaps in the official record. And remember, the most profound, terrifying mysteries of our world are not always hidden in the dark, unexplored corners of the earth. Sometimes they are hidden in plain sight, carefully filed away by the very institutions we blindly trust to tell us the truth.